What's up, guys? Michael here. The saying, geek culture is pop culture, has become a cliche, and with good reason. Superheroes rule the box office. Video games bring in more money than movies, and all the cool kids play tabletop RPGs. It seems the mainstream has shaken off its affected smirk and dived full force into unabashed nerddom. What's more, the ways we interact with pop culture have also changed, reflecting the behaviors of geek culture that normies once shunned. We used to make fun of Trekkies, and comic book fans were roasted for obsessing over the finer details of continuity. Now, you can't even watch a movie where cars go vroom without taking on a laundry list of prior movies and spin-offs.
Wanting to play video games for a living was once equivalent to wanting to be a Power Ranger. Now esports stars make a good chunk of what professional athletes make, without the concussions.
And going to bat for your favorite franchise is now standard practice.
I want to talk about StarCraft 2. In many ways the last hurrah of the single-player RTS, and if you ask me, the rightful queen of the genre.
So how did geek culture become ubiquitous? And does geek culture actually still exist once it's so mainstream? Get yourself comfy for this Wisecrack edition, Is Geek Culture Dead? Since the beginning, geek subculture was concerned with and unified primarily by media, especially genre fiction, which means that geek culture has been inextricably tied to the concept of fandom. Important note, geek culture overlaps with fan culture but doesn't encompass all fandom. Basically, all geeks are fans, but not all fans are geeks. Anyway, modern fandom has really been around since the 1890s when Sherlock Holmes captivated the emerging urban middle class. Holmes fans even protested when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle killed off the beloved detective, so much so that the author begrudgingly brought him back to life. While the term fandom was applied to sports and theater lovers throughout the 19th century,
Sci-fi literature lovers appropriated it as they developed much of the fanish infrastructure, jargon, and language still used to this day, according to scholar Francesca Coppa.
Sci-fi fans started communicating via the letters column of famed magazine Amazing Stories.
Soon, they began to produce their own zines.
Was this geeky behavior? For sure. But according to scholar Lars Konzak, geekdom as we know it today can really be credited to the culture built by World War II veterans, especially engineers and intelligence officers. When veterans returned from war and began their GI Bill-funded higher education, they had the time and space to process what they'd been through.
As Konzak explains, they expressed their reaction to their unique experience by creating and embracing science fiction novels, superhero comic books, and military strategy board games. This, Konzak says, coalesced into its own distinctive alternative intellectual milieu around the Cold War era.
But modern geeky fandom was poised to really explode around 1966,
when sci-fi made the jump from books and movies to the more accessible TV format.
And fans of Star Trek arguably set the blueprint for geek fandom as we know it today. Belittled by the mainstream, they formed a subculture of their own to express their passion. Born in part out of the counterculture movements of the 1960s, Trekkies were super grassroots and self-organized. They created dedicated conventions, popularized fanfic and cosplay, and some argue got their show a third season. As technology progressed, creators could bring ever more engrossing worlds to life. And then, of course, Star Wars hit in '77 and spearheaded the now ubiquitous approach to merchandise. By now, fandom had attracted scholarly attention. Academics' initial reactions to fandom stereotyped these new fans, much like they had sports fans as being pathological. It was even commonly suggested that fans needed psychiatric help, but that didn't stop them. By the 1990s, dedicated fandoms had become pretty commonplace for geeky fiction, all following the grassroots subculture example set by Trekkies. The growth of the internet facilitated greater connection between fans than the readers of Amazing Stories could have ever imagined. By this point, it was possible for people to have been in a fandom for most of their lives. And it was around this time that fan studies scholars started pushing back against prevailing stereotypes. Most notably, there was Henry Jenkins, an academic and fellow fan. Frustrated with the mainstream stereotype of fandoms as mindless and antisocial consumers obsessed with immature stories, Jenkins explored fandoms ethnographically. He framed them as communities, rooted in creative engagement with a given media text, creating new meanings to base the social actions of the subculture on. Key to this is a conflicting set of emotions. To Jenkins, fandom is both fascinated with and frustrated by the media they focus on. They're emotionally invested in the world of the text, but that investment also breeds frustration with the text's inevitable shortcomings. This fuels acts of creation, like fan fiction and art, also known as fan labor. Through acts of fan labor, fandoms are essentially tailoring the text to reflect their own tastes, views, and experiences. Although it's not just creative interpretation. It even extends to acts of evangelism, like when fandoms organize en masse to save their favorite shows. Jenkins labels this participatory culture, where the public has more agency in the formation and definition of their culture. Participatory culture acts as a sort of grassroots counterpoint to mindless media consumption. But even as smart folks started defending fans of geek culture, one thing remained the same: the mainstream's scorn. According to scholar Dan Hassler-Forrest, fans had mainly been perceived by Hollywood film studios as irritants, niche groups of excessively invested consumers whose limited numbers rendered their voices insignificant. Films like Tim Burton's 1989 film Batman were thus purposely tailored to attract the largest mainstream audience rather than to pay homage to fans. According to Hassler-Forrest, that was about to change with one big-ass franchise, Lord of the Rings. Director Peter Jackson savvily embraced the simmering fan anticipation for the film. He gave the blogger behind fan website, The One Ring, a private tour of the set, let her take photographs, and eventually relied on her as a main source of publicity for the sequels. This marked what Hassler-Forrest calls a shifting relationship between fan culture and media industries, where fans were addressed not only as the ideal consumers of a commercial fantastic franchise, but also as valuable contributors to the process. With the commercial success of Lord of the Rings, fans started being viewed as influencers, who could produce hype that would ideally bring in an even larger audience. This potential mushroomed as the internet expanded and media industries started to rely more and more on networked cultures and spreadable media, according to Hassler-Forrest. What's more, performing fanish behavior has become less taboo, which Hassler-Forrest argues is in part due to the radical individualization that marks our social media environment. As a result, a lot more people are doing fandom. And there's every reason to think fans will continue to become more important as Hollywood keeps chasing the most profitable IP.
Some scholars think fandom will become so mainstream as to render the distinction between fan and average audience member virtually insignificant.
Now, mainstream media didn't start embracing fandom out of the goodness of their hearts. Stats show that the most dedicated fans of TV and movies spend around 45% more than the rest. For gamers, it's 230%. What's more, fans vastly outnumber casual viewers. Couple that with fans' zealous dedication to hyping their favorite franchises, and you can see why no red-blooded exec could possibly keep ignoring them. Over the years, geek fandoms have proven to be a valuable commodity to media corporations, which has meant a fundamental shift in how fandoms form. Corporations are now actively looking to create fandoms from day one, with different tactics for different stages of fandom, all to stir fans into the most passionate and profitable state. At the same time, geek culture is becoming increasingly corporatized. Conventions like New York Comic-Con and Chicago Comic and Entertainment Expo and so on are being bought up by ReedPop, a subsidiary of global events organizer Reed Exhibitions, which continues to engulf ever more once grassroots events. At the same time, film studios and media conglomerates have increasingly infiltrated these events, luring fans with exciting exclusive previews that they'll be sure to tweet about. And now, media corporations have found ways to commodify fandom itself by exploiting fan labor. This takes myriad forms, like competitions where the prize is your fan art being used as promotional material or being featured in the movie. That's also known as unpaid labor. Or leveraging IP law against free fan works like short films or game mods only to release their own versions soon after. Even fanfic is being exploited. Take shipping, the practice of creating fanfic around theoretical romantic pairings in an IP. Historically a way for queer fans to create their own representation, popular ships are now being incorporated into marketing and even alluded to in the text themselves, just to get fans in the door. But often, it's a trick. These ships are largely ignored in favor of straight romances. This isn't necessarily the end of the world, but the iron grip corporations are starting to have on fandoms arguably creates problems. When a corporation all but controls a subculture, can you really call it a subculture anymore? And what happens when a subculture, used to operating as outcasts in opposition to the mainstream, finds their forum confined by corporate oversight? Similarly, subcultures like those surrounding indie rock, punk, and emo music have encountered these same tensions. Essentially, fandoms used to play in the woods, but corporations have paved them over with a high-fenced jungle gym. The question then poses itself. When fandom is mainstream, does it even really exist anymore? Fans may be courted by corporations, but do they actually have power? Especially when a few media conglomerates own almost all of popular culture's IP. It depends who you ask. From Jenkins' interpretation, fandom could be seen as an active way to invert the increased consolidation of IP. He argued that fanfic in particular is a way of the culture repairing the damage done in a system where contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of owned by the folk. This interpretation sees fans as active creators and consumers of their favorite geek media, rather than passive receptacles for whatever corporate media wants them to stand. This is interesting because Jenkins acknowledges that the media that fandoms form around are essentially corporate products. Regardless of the empowering aspects of Jenkins' proposed participatory culture, fandoms are still emotionally invested in something that corporations make for profit, which is why others argue that the fan autonomy celebrated by Jenkins is something of an illusion. Some of this has to do with the power of the mighty IP. As Simone Murray puts it, the ultimate discretion of media conglomerates to shut down fan creations around corporate-owned properties renders hollow much cultural studies champion of fans' contrarian impulse. That is to say, when Disney, by way of Marvel, can sue you for using too many clips in your reaction video to Ant-Man, can you actually take culture into your own hands? According to Hassler Forrest, not really. He argues that there's a grossly asymmetrical relationship between fans and media producers, such that fan autonomy becomes somewhat illusory. He writes that when beloved stories become highly profitable global entertainment brands, they no longer make up a form of cultural commons that can be appropriated, embellished, transformed, or subverted. Instead, they become lucrative corporate franchises made up of a wide range of commodities, most of which are dependent upon fans to achieve their desired commercial value. That is to say, media producers have both the power to stop fans from circulating their arts and the resources to produce a gobsmacking amount of content and products. In both limiting fan production and aggressively encouraging fan consumption, media producers are arguably co-opting fan culture while stymieing its expression. What this argument really spotlights is the tension between the two sides of fandom: fans as anti-commercial subcultures organized on a grassroots level, and fans as rabid consumers and promoters of corporate IP. And as fandom becomes increasingly mainstream, that tension might just constitute one of the most important debates about how we consume media. But what do you guys think? Has corporate involvement changed what it means to be a fan? Is there still room for geek culture? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support, and don't forget to check out our podcast. Shove that subscribe button like it's a nerd at their locker, and don't forget to ring that bell. And as always, thanks for watching. Later.